The Appalachian Mountains are among the oldest land masses on Earth. They're ancient, crumbling, forested peaks that have watched entire civilizations rise and fall in their cold shadows. To the average tourist driving along the scenic Blue Ridge Parkway in the safety of daylight, they are a place of breathtaking beauty, a postcard of endless green forests, vibrant autumn leaves, and rolling morning fog. But to those who have lived in the deep, isolated hollers for generations, to the locals who truly know what breathes in the dark, these mountains are a place of strict, unspoken rules. If you are walking in the woods at dusk and you hear your name being called from the tree line, you do not look back. You keep walking. If you hear the sound of a baby crying deep in the brush, miles from any road, you lock your doors and you ignore it. If you are hiking and the forest suddenly goes dead silent, no birds singing, no wind rustling the leaves, no insects buzzing, you turn around and walk away as fast as your legs can carry you. Because the terrifying truth is, the Appalachians are not empty. They are vast, mostly unmapped, deeply unforgiving, and they hide geographical pockets where the modern world simply does not exist. They are inhabited by things and people that society has entirely forgotten. People who have shed their humanity to survive in the dark. Welcome to Prince of Darkness. Tonight, we unearth 4 terrifying, untold accounts of the deep woods, stories of hidden communities, feral individuals who have forgotten how to be human, secret cults performing rituals in the dead of night, and the classified horrors that search and rescue teams refuse to talk about. These are not campfire tales invented to scare children. These are warnings from the people who barely made it out alive. Lock your doors. Draw your blinds, turn down the lights, and whatever you do, do not go into the woods after dark. Our first account comes from a former seasonal trail maintenance worker for the U.S. Forest Service. In the late 1990s, he was stationed in an incredibly remote sector of the Blackwater Ridge. It was a job meant for people who thrived in complete isolation. My job was simple but physically grueling. I was tasked with hiking into the deepest, most inaccessible sections of the ridge to clear fallen timber, repair trail washouts, and ensure the painted trail markers were visible for the upcoming spring season. I spent weeks completely alone in the wilderness, living out of a heavy canvas tent, carrying everything I needed on my back. I loved the isolation. I thrived on the silence. Or at least, I did until the last week of October. It was a Tuesday, late in the afternoon. A freak autumn storm had rolled in off the coast much faster than the radio had predicted, turning the sky a bruised, sickly purple. The temperature was plummeting by the minute, and the wind was picking up aggressively, violently swaying the massive pines and threatening to snap the dead branches overhead. I was at least 8 miles from my base camp. Carrying an 80-pound pack, I knew I wouldn't make it back before the freezing rain started. Exposure out here meant death. Consulting my heavily worn topographical map, I noticed an old surveyor's shelter marked about a mile off trail. It was located deep in a steep, narrow valley that rarely saw sunlight. Desperate for any kind of solid cover, I broke Forest Service protocol and headed off the marked path, pushing into the thick, untamed brush. The woods changed almost immediately the deeper I descended into that valley. The familiar, comforting sounds of the forest vanished. The birds stopped singing. The squirrels stopped chattering. Even the wind, which had been howling violently just moments before, died down into a suffocating, heavy silence. It felt like I had stepped into a vacuum. The air grew unnaturally stagnant and thick. That's when the smell hit me. It wasn't the natural scent of damp earth, decaying autumn leaves, or pine sap. It was the sharp, metallic tang of old, dried blood, mixed with the sour, sickening stench of unwashed bodies, rotting meat, and something deeply feral. It smelled like a predator's den. I pushed through a dense thicket of mountain laurel, the branches scraping against my waterproof jacket, and stumbled into a small, muddy clearing. In the center of the clearing stood a structure that made every hair on my arms and the back of my neck stand at rigid attention. It wasn't a standardized Forest Service shelter. It was a shack, a terrifying makeshift hovel built entirely out of scavenged, rotting wood, rusted corrugated metal sheets, and bones. Hundreds of them. The skulls of white-tailed deer, the shattered rib cages of coyotes, the femurs of large mammals I couldn't identify, all bleached white by the sun and woven intricately into the very walls of the structure using dried vines and thick, leathery strips of animal hide. Every survival instinct I possessed was screaming at me to turn around and run back into the storm. But as I stood there, frozen in terror, I saw a faint, flickering orange light glowing through the cracks in the bone walls. I thought, naively, that maybe another hiker was trapped inside, or perhaps a lost hunter who needed help. I unclipped my heavy mag-light flashlight from my belt, gripping the cold metal cylinder like a club, and approached the door, which was nothing more than a patchwork of hides hanging by thick leather strips. "Hello?" I called. My voice sounded pathetic, weak, swallowed instantly by the dead, heavy air of the valley. The response I got wasn't a human voice. It was a sound I will hear in my nightmares for the rest of my life. A low, rhythmic clicking, like someone rapidly snapping their teeth together in the dark. Click-clack, click-clack, click-clack. My hand trembled violently as I reached out and pushed the heavy hide door open just an inch. The smell that wafted out was so highly concentrated and putrid that my eyes watered and my stomach violently lurched. Inside, the floor was covered in a thick, squishy layer of matted fur, dirt, and dried black blood. Sitting by a small, smokeless fire built in a depression in the dirt was a woman. At least, she used to be a woman. Her hair was a matted, dreadlocked nest of gray and filth, cemented together with mud and grease, reaching all the way down to her waist. Her skin was the color of wet, decaying parchment, stretched so tight over a skeletal frame that I could count every single rib protruding from her chest. She wasn't wearing manufactured clothes. She was draped in raw, uncured animal hides, stitched together with dried tendons. But it was her face, her eyes, that broke my sanity. They were wide, bulbous, and milky white with thick cataracts, yet they locked on to my position with a predatory, calculating intensity that was purely animalistic. She didn't stand up like a human being. She crouched on all fours, her fingers, which were abnormally long, claw-like, and caked in black, compacted dirt, digging deeply into the earth. Then, from the pitch-black corners of the shack, the clicking grew louder, multiplying. Two smaller figures crawled slowly out of the shadows. They were children by their size, but their bodies were warped. Their faces were twisted, their jaws jutting forward, their eyes too far apart, the undeniable, horrifying genetic markers of generations of deep, terrifying isolation and inbreeding. They didn't speak a word. They didn't cry like normal children. They just watched me, their heads tilting in perfect, terrifying unison, observing me not as a person, but as prey. The woman slowly opened her jaw and let out a wet, guttural hiss, baring teeth that had been manually filed down to sharp, jagged points. That was my cue. The paralysis broke. I didn't think. I didn't try to reason. I just turned and sprinted. I didn't care about the freezing rain that had started to fall in sheets. I didn't care about the heavy pack on my back, the jagged rocks tearing through the soles of my boots, or the thick briar thorns shredding my jacket and my face. I ran until my lungs burned like they were filled with acid and my legs went completely numb. As I ran, I could hear them behind me, but it wasn't the heavy, clumsy, two-legged footsteps of a person running. It was the light, rapid, terrifying patter of hands and feet hitting the forest floor. They were scampering through the dense, dark brush on all fours with horrifying, impossible speed, completely unbothered by the pitch-black conditions. They were hunting me. They chased me relentlessly for 3 miles. I only survived because I managed to cross a massive, hollowed-out log near the bank and buried myself in the wet rot, shivering uncontrollably in the freezing water, clutching my flashlight until the sun finally came up. When I finally made it back to my Forest Service truck parked at the trailhead, I threw my gear into the bed, jumped into the cab, and locked the doors, my hands shaking so hard I could barely get the key into the ignition. I was ready to drive straight to the state police. I was ready to scream for a tactical team. But as I grabbed the steering wheel, my breath hitched in my throat. I froze. Pressed against the outside of my driver's side window, perfectly preserved in the thin morning frost, was a handprint. It was small, caked in dried mud that had frozen to the glass, and it had 6 long, distinctly articulated fingers. They hadn't lost my trail at the creek. They had tracked me all the way back to civilization. They didn't kill me in the woods because they didn't want to. They let me live to send a message. That handprint was a statement. They wanted me to know that they knew exactly what my truck looked like and exactly where I parked it. I drove straight to the ranger station, packed my personal belongings, and quit the Forest Service that very morning. I never filed a report about the shack, because if you tell the United States government that there's a tribe of feral, cannibalistic, inbred humans living off the grid in the Blackwater Ridge, they will put you in a psychiatric ward. But I know what I saw in that cabin. I know what chased me in the dark, and I know they are still out there. Our previous account dealt with the terror of feral survival, but our second account involves something far more organized, far more deliberate, and infinitely more sinister. It comes from a freelance wildlife photographer who rented an off-grid cabin in the Great Smoky Mountains to photograph nocturnal predators. What his camera captured, however, was a horror entirely man-made. I make my living photographing elusive wildlife, which requires me to spend long stretches of time in deep isolation. I had rented a small, deeply isolated A-frame cabin in a geographical bowl known locally as Whispering Valley. The nearest paved road was a grueling 40-minute drive down a treacherous, unmaintained dirt logging path. The cabin had no running water, absolutely no cell service, and was powered entirely by a small, unreliable solar generator. It was the perfect silent setup for my work. I could set up my infrared trail cameras deep in the woods and review the footage in total, undisturbed peace. My first 3 nights were perfectly normal. I captured beautiful, rare footage of black bears, a pack of coyotes, and a massive, stealthy bobcat. But on the 4th night, the very atmosphere of the valley seemed to shift. The air grew heavy. I woke up at exactly 3:33 a.m. I know the time because the glowing red digits of my battery-powered alarm clock were the first things I saw. I didn't wake up naturally. I was pulled from a deep sleep by a vibration. It was a low, rhythmic thumping. It vibrated through the wooden floorboards of the old cabin, traveling up through the wooden legs of my bed. Thump, thump, thump. It sounded like a massive, heavy skin drum being struck with incredible force somewhere deep in the woods, echoing off the valley walls. Accompanying the deep, vibrating drum was a sound that made my blood run cold. It was a low, atonal chanting. Dozens of voices murmuring in perfect, terrifying synchronization, speaking a language I couldn't even begin to identify. It wasn't a Native American dialect, it wasn't Latin, and it certainly wasn't English. It sounded guttural, harsh, and incredibly ancient, like stones grinding against each other. I carefully slipped out of bed, keeping the lights off. I grabbed my primary DSLR camera, attached a heavy $4,000 telephoto lens with superior low-light capabilities, and crept toward the large front window of the A-frame that overlooked the valley floor. I peered through the glass, holding my breath, my hands gripping the camera tight to stop the shaking. About 200 yards away, moving slowly along the edge of the dark tree line, was a procession. There must have been at least 40 people. They were walking in a single-file line, moving with a synchronized, hypnotic, almost mechanical gait. I lifted the heavy camera, pressed my eye to the viewfinder, and zoomed in. When the autofocus clicked, my stomach violently lurched. They were wearing long, tattered robes made of what looked like dirty burlap, heavy canvas, and unwashed animal hides. But their faces were completely hidden. Every single person in that procession was wearing a mask. Some wore the hollowed-out, bleached skulls of deer and elk, the massive antlers casting long, terrifying, spider-like shadows in the moonlight. Others wore crude masks made of stitched-together dried leather with no eye holes cut out, just a single ragged vertical slit for the mouth. They were carrying heavy wooden torches that burned with a strange, sickly blue-green flame, likely from some chemical accelerant mixed with the pitch. But the true horror was in the center of the line. In the middle of the procession, 4 massive, broad-shouldered men were carrying a heavy wooden palanquin, a crude makeshift stretcher made of thick pine branches. I adjusted the focus ring on my lens, trying to see what was resting on the stretcher. When the image sharpened, a wave of pure nausea hit me so hard I almost dropped the camera. Bound to the wood with thick, heavy nautical ropes was a human figure. It was thrashing wildly, fighting desperately against the restraints, arching its back in sheer panic, but its mouth was gagged with a heavy cloth tied tightly around its head. It was a young man. He was wearing modern, expensive hiking clothes, a bright orange Patagonia jacket that stood out starkly, violently against the dark, filthy robes of the cultists. I was watching a kidnapping, or worse, a human sacrifice. I pulled my camera away from the window, hyperventilating. The air in my lungs felt like glass. I needed to call the police immediately. I grabbed my cell phone from the nightstand, but the screen mockingly displayed no service. I was completely trapped. If I tried to run to my truck and start it, the roar of the diesel engine would echo through the entire silent valley, alerting 40 armed fanatics to my exact location. They would be on me in seconds. I forced myself to look back through the window. The procession had stopped. The drum had ceased beating. The chanting had died abruptly. The silence that followed was deafening. The figure at the very front of the line, a towering, massive man wearing a complete, rotting bear skull over his head and shoulders, had stopped walking. He slowly turned his head away from the procession. He looked directly up the hill, directly at my dark cabin. Even from 200 yards away, separated by glass and shadows, I felt the terrifying weight of his gaze. He slowly raised a long wooden staff adorned with feathers and bone, pointing it straight at my window. As one, the entire procession turned to face the cabin. 40 masked, inhuman faces staring up at me in dead, unnatural silence. Then, 3 of the robed figures broke off from the main group. They didn't walk. They began sprinting up the steep, snowy hill toward my cabin. And they didn't run like normal people. They ran with a terrifying, unnatural speed and fluidity, their robes billowing behind them like massive, dark wings, closing the distance with impossible speed. Blind panic took over. I dropped my $4,000 camera on the floor, grabbed my truck keys, snatched a heavy iron fire poker from the hearth, and ran to the back door of the cabin. I quietly slipped out into the freezing night air and sprinted toward my truck parked in the rear clearing. Just as I unlocked the driver's door and yanked it open, I heard the heavy, solid oak front door of the cabin completely shatter. They hadn't tried the handle. They hadn't tried to pick the lock. They had battered it completely off its hinges in a matter of seconds. I threw myself into the cab, jammed the key into the ignition, and turned it. The heavy diesel engine roared to life. I slammed my hand on the headlights, flipping on the high beams. Standing not 10 feet from the front bumper of my truck, illuminated perfectly in the blinding halogen light, was one of the cultists. The light revealed his mask in horrific detail. It was a burlap sack, stained black around the neck with dried blood, with a crude, massive smile painted on it in white ash. He didn't flinch at the lights. He didn't move out of the way. He just tilted his head to the side like a curious dog, raising a heavy, rusted, serrated machete in his right hand. I didn't honk. I didn't yell. I slammed my foot on the gas pedal. The heavy truck surged forward, tires spinning in the dirt before catching traction. The man in the burlap mask dove out of the way at the very last possible fraction of a second, my heavy side mirror violently clipping his shoulder and sending him spinning into the snow. I drove down that treacherous, winding dirt road at 60 miles an hour in the pitch black, practically flying over the massive potholes, waiting for my tires to blow out or to careen off the cliff edge. I didn't tap the brakes until I reached the state highway, where I pulled into a brightly lit 24-hour gas station, ran inside screaming, and begged the attendant to lock the doors and call the state police. When the heavily armed authorities went up to the cabin the next morning, they found the front door smashed to splinters. Every single piece of my camera equipment, my laptop, and my hard drives had been completely destroyed, systematically smashed into tiny, unrecoverable pieces. The police launched a massive multi-agency search of the Whispering Valley. They brought in tracking bloodhounds, thermal imaging helicopters, and dozens of local volunteers. They scoured the woods for 3 days. They found absolutely nothing. No torch marks on the trees, no footprints in the mud, no abandoned campsites, no ritual sites, and they never, ever found a young man wearing an orange Patagonia jacket. The official police report, signed by the local sheriff, stated that a hungry black bear had broken into my cabin looking for food, and that I had hallucinated the cult procession due to severe isolation-induced anxiety and sleep deprivation. But I know what I saw through that telephoto lens. I know the detail of those masks. There's a deeply organized, highly violent, and completely untraceable society operating entirely off the grid in those mountains. And they take people. They just take them. Our third account explores the terrifying, claustrophobic reality of what happens when the feral inhabitants of the deep woods decide that your newly purchased home is actually part of their hunting territory. This story comes from a young, optimistic couple who purchased a cheap, foreclosed property on the very edge of the Appalachian Trail in West Virginia, hoping to build a quiet life away from the city. My wife and I thought we had found the absolute perfect property, our dream home. It was a beautiful, rustic, 2-story log cabin sitting perfectly in the center of 5 acres of dense, untouched forest. The price was unbelievably low, an absolute steal, which the realtor quickly attributed to the home being a bank foreclosure that had sat empty and neglected for nearly 5 years. We bought it in cash, moved our belongings, and immediately began renovations. The first month was idyllic. The autumn leaves were beautiful, the air was crisp, but as winter rapidly approached, bringing with it early, dark evenings and freezing temperatures, the woods began to feel less like a sanctuary and more like a massive, inescapable cage. It started with small, easily rationalized things. I would leave a heavy framing hammer, a box of nails, or a spool of copper wire on the back porch overnight, and by the next morning, they would be gone, vanished. I blamed local raccoons, teenagers from a neighboring town, or simply my own forgetfulness amidst the chaos of renovation. Then we started finding the traps. My wife was walking our massive 90-pound German Shepherd, Max, near the edge of the property line one afternoon when she found it. It wasn't a manufactured steel bear trap you buy at a hunting store. It was a primitive, brutal, highly lethal snare. It was made of tightly braided vines, thick wire stolen from my porch, and sharpened, fire-hardened wooden stakes, carefully and expertly hidden under a pile of dead leaves on a path we walked every day. If Max had stepped in it, the tension would have driven the stakes through his leg, shattering the bone instantly. I destroyed the trap with a sledgehammer, furious, and called the local county sheriff. He drove out, took one look at the splintered remains of the snare, and let out a long, tired sigh. "You got squatters," the sheriff told me, rubbing the back of his neck. "Mountain folk. They live deep off-grid, way up in the ridges where we can't get cruisers. They probably got used to hunting, foraging, and walking on this property while the house was empty all those years. They don't respect property lines. Just keep your doors locked, get a gun if you don't have one, and put up some heavy-duty motion sensor lights. They're like roaches. They usually scatter if you shine a bright light on them." Taking his advice to the extreme, I went to the hardware store and bought the brightest industrial-grade, blindingly white motion sensor floodlights I could afford and mounted them all around the perimeter of the cabin under the eaves. For a few weeks, the lights stayed off. Things went quiet. I thought the sheriff was right. I thought we had won. I was completely, terrifyingly wrong. We hadn't scared them away. We'd just forced them to observe us longer, to adapt. It was a late Friday night in mid-December. A heavy, blinding snowstorm had fallen throughout the day, blanketing the property in over a foot of pure, undisturbed white powder. My wife had gone to sleep upstairs hours ago, and I was in the living room downstairs, reading a book by the heat of the wood-burning fireplace. At exactly 2:14 a.m., the motion sensor light in the backyard clicked on with a sharp clack, flooding the snow outside the sliding glass door with blinding, sterile white light. I stopped reading and set my book down. Max, who was sleeping peacefully at my feet, immediately stood up. But he didn't behave normally. The thick hair on his back bristled all the way to his tail, and he let out a low, vibrating, continuous growl that seemed to rattle in his chest. He didn't run to the glass door to bark aggressively like he usually did when he saw a deer or a stray dog. He backed away from the glass. He tucked his tail, bared his teeth, and slowly retreated towards the stairs, putting himself between the door and the second floor where my wife slept. Seeing my massive, fearless guard dog retreat in sheer terror scared me more than the light turning on. I walked slowly, silently, in my socks, to the large sliding glass door that looked out over the backyard patio. I cupped my hands around my eyes, pressing my face to the cold glass to block the glare from the living room fire, and peered out into the snow. At first, I didn't see anything. Just the blinding white light reflecting off the pristine snowdrifts. Then, a dark shadow detached itself from the dense tree line. It was a person, but they weren't walking upright. They were crawling through the deep snow on their hands and knees, moving with a jerky, hypermobile, insect-like flexibility that defied normal human anatomy. They were wearing filthy, dark rags wrapped tightly around their body for warmth, and their face was a thick, dark layer of mud or grease to cut the glare of the snow. They crawled out into the open, stopping every few feet to violently sniff the air like a hunting hound. Then a second figure emerged from the dark trees, and a third, and a fourth. Within seconds, there were 6 feral human beings crawling across my snowy backyard in absolute silence. They were scavenging. Moving with terrifying pack-like coordination, they approached our heavy, locked plastic garbage cans. Bypassing the complex animal-proof locking mechanisms with frightening, practiced intelligence, they popped the lids and began silently, frantically pulling out scraps of food, stuffing it into their rags. I was paralyzed. I was standing in my warm, modern living room, watching a pack of wild, feral humans scavenge my property like a pack of starving coyotes. I slowly reached into my pocket, pulled out my cell phone, and dialed 911. As the phone began to ring in my ear, I looked back out the window. One of them, a large, heavily muscled, towering male, had stopped digging in the trash. He was standing up. He stood perfectly upright, revealing his true height of at least 6'4", and slowly turned his head toward the house. He saw me standing in the window. The 911 dispatcher answered in my ear. 911, what is your emergency? Before I could speak a single word, the massive feral man raised his long, filthy hand and pointed a single finger directly at me. The other 5 scavengers immediately stopped what they were doing, dropped the trash, and looked uniformly at the house. "There are people in my backyard," I whispered into the phone, my voice trembling, terrified that they could somehow hear me through the double-paned glass. "They're trespassing. Send the police right now. Hurry!" The feral man didn't run away. He didn't scatter like the sheriff said he would. Instead, he took a slow, deliberate, heavy step toward the glass door. Then another. He walked right up onto the wooden patio, his bare, frost-bitten feet leaving bloody prints on the wood. He stood just inches from the glass. The blinding motion light illuminated his face perfectly. His eyes were wide, heavily bloodshot, and completely devoid of human empathy, warmth, or reason. He had deep, jagged, self-inflicted scars carved in his cheeks. He pressed his filthy, grease-stained hands against the glass. I backed away, instinctively grabbing a heavy 10-inch chef's knife from the kitchen butcher block. Then he opened his mouth. He didn't scream, he didn't grunt, he didn't bang on the glass. He spoke. But it wasn't his voice. It wasn't the gruff, deep voice of a mountain man. He perfectly, flawlessly mimicked the voice of my sleeping wife. The pitch, the delicate tone, the slight southern drawl. It was a perfect auditory copy. "Honey," the feral man said, his voice muffled by the thick glass but perfectly clear in the silent living room. "Honey, open the door. It's cold out here. Please, let me in." My brain completely short-circuited. I felt a wave of cold horror wash over my entire body. I knew for an absolute fact that my wife was asleep upstairs in our bed. But hearing her exact, precise voice coming from the throat of this filthy, grinning, wild man standing in the snow was the most psychologically violating, terrifying thing I have ever experienced. They had been listening to us for months, hiding in the brush during the summer, listening to us talk on the patio. They had studied us. They had memorized our routines, our names, and our voices. They were hunting us. I didn't answer. I just stood there, shaking violently, pointing the trembling knife at the glass, ready to fight for my life. The man tilted his head, realizing the psychological trick hadn't worked. I wasn't going to unlock the door. A slow, sickening, impossibly wide smile spread across his scarred face, revealing rotting teeth. He tapped the glass twice with a long, dirty nail file. Tink, tink. Turned around and walked casually, arrogantly back into the dark tree line with the rest of his pack. The state police arrived 20 minutes later with their sirens blaring. Heavily armed, they followed the bare footprints in the snow 3 miles deep into the woods. The tracks led directly to a series of massive, jagged rock crevices and deep cave systems. The police stopped at the entrance. They flat out refused to enter the caves without a heavily armed SWAT team and tactical lighting, citing the extreme danger of ambush. We packed our bags that very night and stayed in a brightly lit hotel in the city. We listed the house the next day at a massive financial loss and never went back, leaving all of our furniture behind. I warn anyone who will listen. If you buy a cheap, secluded house in the deep woods of the Appalachians, you need to understand a fundamental truth. You do not own that land. Your deed means nothing in the dark.
You are just a guest, and the true owners are always, always watching.
If the previous stories have not convinced you of the hidden horrors of the mountains, this final, highly classified account from a veteran search and rescue officer will shatter any remaining illusions of safety. Our final account comes from a veteran search and rescue officer who spent 20 years leading rescue teams in the Great Smoky Mountains National Park before a single horrific night forced him into early, traumatized retirement. There are rules in search and rescue that you will not find in any official manual. They are passed down verbally from the veterans to the rookies. Rule number 1. If you are searching a grid deep in the woods and you find a perfectly built standalone staircase leading nowhere, you do not approach it, you do not touch it, and you certainly do not walk up it. You turn your radio off, walk away, and pretend you never saw it. Rule number 2. If you are tracking a missing person and their footprints suddenly stop in the middle of a muddy clearing with no signs of struggle, no tracks leading away, and no branches broken overhead, you mark the GPS coordinates, you tell the family the trail went cold, and you stop looking, because whatever took them didn't take them by land. And rule number 3, the most important rule: if you hear the voice of the person you are looking for calling your specific name from the canopy of the trees, you do not look up. I followed these rules for 20 years. I brought dozens of lost hikers home. I recovered the bodies of those who succumbed to the elements. I thought I had seen the worst the woods had to offer. Until the Jacob Miller search. Jacob was an 8-year-old boy who vanished from a highly populated, incredibly safe campsite near the edge of the park. One minute he was playing with his plastic trucks near the fire pit, and the next he was simply gone. No sound, no footprints leading away, just vanished. We launched a massive grid search. I was leading a team of 3 highly trained men, myself, a tracker named Davis, and a medic named Ruiz. We were assigned Grid Sector 4, an incredibly dense, treacherous area of old-growth forest that was notorious for dead radio zones and compass malfunctions. By nightfall of the second day, a heavy, unseasonably cold rain began to fall. The woods turned into a black, muddy nightmare. Our high-powered halogen flashlights could barely cut through the thick mist rising from the forest floor. At around 2 a.m., Davis, our tracker, signaled for us to stop. He was kneeling in the mud, shining his flashlight on the ground. "I got prints," Davis whispered, his voice tight with confusion. I knelt beside him. There, pressed deep into the mud, were the clear, unmistakable prints of a child's sneakers. The tread matched Jacob's shoes perfectly, but that wasn't what had Davis spooked. "Look at the spacing," Davis said, pointing his light ahead. The footprints were spaced nearly 10 feet apart, an impossible stride for a grown man, let alone an 8-year-old. It looked as if the child was bounding or being carried by something massive that was taking enormous, heavy leaps. We followed the tracks for another mile, our radios completely dead, emitting only thick, angry static. The tracks led us to the base of a massive, sheer rock cliff face that wasn't on our topographical maps. And at the base of the cliff was the entrance to a cave. It wasn't a natural cave. The opening was a perfect geometric square cut into the solid granite with absolute impossible precision. The rock around the opening was smooth, almost polished, like black glass. Standing at the entrance, the air temperature plummeted by at least 20 degrees. But it wasn't just cold. The air smelled of ozone, burning copper, and ancient stagnant dust. "We shouldn't go in there," Ruiz, the medic, said, his voice shaking. "This isn't right. The geography is wrong." But I was the team leader. I had a duty. Jacob's tracks lead right to the edge. We do a quick sweep of the entrance. If we don't see him, we mark it and fall back.
We clicked our flashlights to their highest settings and stepped into the square opening. The moment we crossed the threshold, the sound of the heavy rain outside was completely cut off. Not muffled, cut off entirely, as if someone had hit a mute button on the universe. The silence inside that tunnel was heavy, oppressive, and rang in our ears. The tunnel was perfectly square, stretching straight into the dark. But as we walked, the geometry of the place began to deeply mess with our minds. My equilibrium vanished. I felt like I was walking on a steep incline, yet my eyes told me the floor was perfectly flat. Then we heard it. Coming from the impenetrable darkness deep within the tunnel, we heard a voice. "Help me, please, I'm cold."
It was a child's voice. It sounded exactly like the descriptions of Jacob. Ruiz broke protocol. "Jacob, we're coming, buddy. Stay where you are," he yelled, his voice echoing unnaturally against the smooth, glass-like walls. We started running down the tunnel, but the voice didn't get closer. Then, the voice changed. It was no longer the voice of a scared little boy. The voice fractured. It split into 3 distinct, perfectly synchronized voices speaking simultaneously. "Help me, please, I'm cold," the voices repeated, echoing off the walls. But it wasn't Jacob's voice anymore. It was my voice. It was Davis's voice. It was Ruiz's voice. Whatever was down there in the dark was perfectly mimicking the exact pitch and tone of our own voices, pleading for help in a mocking, synchronized choir. We slammed to a halt. Davis raised his high-powered rifle, aiming it into the dark. My flashlight beam hit something moving in the shadows about 50 yards ahead. It wasn't a child. It wasn't a feral human. I can only describe it as a mass, a towering, shifting silhouette of too many limbs unfolding itself from the ceiling of the tunnel. It didn't have a face that the light could catch, but it had eyes. Dozens of pale, luminescent, milky eyes that opened across its shifting mass, all locking onto us at once. And then, from that mass of darkness, using our own voices, it said my name. "Captain Miller, come deeper into the dark." I didn't give the order to retreat. I just turned and ran. We all did. We ran blindly toward the square entrance of the cave, our boots slipping on the slick black stone. I could hear the thing unfolding behind us, moving not with footsteps, but with a wet, heavy, slithering sound that vibrated through the floor. We burst out of the cave entrance and collapsed into the freezing, pouring rain, scrambling desperately up the muddy embankment, not looking back until we were a mile away. We navigated back to base camp entirely by compass, arriving just as the sun broke over the mountains. We were covered in mud, hyperventilating, and deeply, fundamentally traumatized. When the search and rescue commander asked for our debriefing, I told him exactly what we saw. I told him about the square cave, the impossible footprints, and the shifting mass that stole our voices. The commander didn't look surprised. He didn't call me crazy. He just looked incredibly tired. He pulled a thick black binder from his desk, opened it, and handed me a non-disclosure agreement. "Sign it," he said, his voice flat. "You found a bear den. The tracks were a bear. The search for Jacob Miller is officially being called off due to severe weather conditions." "There is something down there," I yelled at him. "It wasn't a bear." The commander leaned over the desk, his eyes hard and cold. "I know it wasn't a bear, Miller. I've been doing this for 30 years. There are fault lines in these mountains that don't just crack the earth, they crack other things. Things we don't have the science or the religion to understand. If we tell the public what is actually living in the deep zones, nobody would ever step foot in a national park again. The panic would be uncontrollable. Sign the paper, go home, and never speak of Sector 4 again." I signed the paper. I retired the next day. They never found Jacob Miller. I tell this story now, anonymously, because people need to know the wilderness is not a playground. It is not a hiking trail or a scenic vacation spot.
It is a highly active predatory ecosystem, and humans, we are not at the top of the food chain in the dark.
The wilderness does not care about our modern technology, our societal laws, or our perceived dominance as a species. It is an ancient, breathing, calculating entity that harbors secrets it has kept flawlessly for millennia. The people in these 4 stories survived because they recognized the immediate, terrifying danger before it was too late. They listened to their primal instincts. But every single year, hundreds of hikers, campers, and amateur explorers vanish in the Appalachian Mountains without leaving a single solitary trace behind. Are they merely victims of the harsh elements? Did they simply slip and fall? Or did they wander just a little too far off the marked trail into the wrong valley at the wrong time of night? Did they stumble upon a bone cabin, interrupt a silent procession, fall prey to the feral neighbors in the shadows, or walk into a perfectly square cave from which nothing ever returns? If you have your own terrifying, unexplained encounter from the deep woods, leave it in the comments below. I read every single one, and your story might be featured in our next Descent into the Dark. If this documentary made you rethink your next camping trip, hit that like button to appease the algorithm, and subscribe to Prince of Darkness for more deep-dive true horror and dark documentaries. Until next time, stay on the marked path, double-check your locks, and stay out of the deep woods. Good night.